Uh, We're going to start. I'm Paul Fuhrer and am acting chair until we elect a new chair, which hopefully will happen at the next meeting. But we were unable, I guess, to notice that in the election in advance of this meeting. So I'd like to call to order the May 16th meeting of the Board of Directors of Covered California, and it's 10:01. That'll do. And now I'd like to take the roll. So we'll start with Dr. Mark Gailey, whom we now welcome.
Present.
Art Torres.
Here.
Sandra Hernandez.
Here?
Jerry Fleming.
Here.
So it looks like we have a quorum. Everybody's here, nobody's absent. Now, I need to know, or we need to know, if any agenda item presents or may present a conflict of interest. This will ensure that I can announce your non-participation in any aspect of that item in compliance with applicable laws. Are there any items?
No, sir.
Hearing none, we will adjourn to our closed session for approximately 1.5 hours.
That's not right. 2.5 hours. Sorry, typo.
Oh, okay, 2.5 hours. Pursuant to Government Code 100-500J, to consider contracting, personnel, and litigation matters. We will reconvene in public session at approximately 12:30, and we currently estimate the open session will conclude at approximately 3 p.m. First, I'd like to introduce and welcome Dr. Mark Gailey, who was appointed by Governor Newsom to serve as our new Health and Human Services Secretary. So it's our first meeting, and a happy welcome to Mark.
Thank you.
I'm still serving as the acting board chair until we hold an election to appoint a new board chair, but that also requires a notice requirement, which was not done for this meeting. So I expect that will happen in our June meeting, that will make that final appointment. Now that we're back in open sessions, we will start with a report, as always, from our executive director on the various actions taken in the closed session. I should note also that we did convene at approximately 10 o'clock this morning. We have a quorum, everybody's here today, and that there were no issues of conflicts of interest that needed to be disclosed. Also, a reminder before I turn to Peter, that the June board is somewhat differently scheduled than is our norm. It will be on a Wednesday, June 26th, and it will start at 9. And the open session is expected to start soon thereafter. I think it's at 9:30. And that's because of other scheduling situations in the afternoon. And as always, we welcome participation from those who are not only here, but also those who call in. With that, actually, I guess first I will start with just the minutes and get that out of the way. I'll ask board members if they have any corrections or clarifications. Actually, before I say that, I should note that Peter and I found some minor technical edits and so on in the last couple of days. And there is actually an amended version. There's nothing of substance that was changed, but just some basic corrections. So we're actually going to approve an amended version that has those minor fixes. So with that, I turn to board members and ask if they have any
I'll move
comments,
them.
questions, corrections. Seeing none,
Sandra moved it. Needs-
oh, okay. Okay, then, are there any public comments about the minutes? Good, seeing none. And also no one's on the phone. Let me take the roll for the vote. Jerry?
Aye.
Sandra?
Aye.
Art?
Aye.
Mark?
Abstain.
Oh, okay, yes, because you were not here. And I'm aye as well, so they've passed. With that, I'm going to turn to Peter.
Paul, thank you very much, and I want to join you and join, as all of us have, welcoming Dr. Galley to the board. Great to have you on board. In terms of closed session, I know the board dealt with a wide array of contracting personnel matters, and in particular on the contracting matters, had a deep dive introduction to the negotiating sessions we are about to enter into with our health plans. We've received preliminary rates. We're in the beginning of those negotiation processes. Obviously, a major variable with regard to what we'll see for 2020 will be determined in the next 3 weeks on whether or not there's a penalty in place and whether or not there are new subsidies. Those factors will have dramatic impacts on the 2020 rates. But we are working with plans on getting bids and negotiating on a couple what-if scenarios on what if there is a state penalty and the increasing enrollment and healthier risk mix that results or is not. And so that's one of the things you will all be hearing more about, but we briefed the board on that in some detail. We also spent extensive time talking about Cover California's lease opportunities. We have a number of long-term leases coming up for review and needing to look at long-term planning issues for our Sacramento office, Rancho Cordova, and Fresno, and all of those were taken up in closed session. Finally, in reviewing the agenda, I'd note that we have only one action item before the board today, which is on our benefit designs, which were discussed in February and March, but we have a very minor adjustment that needs to be made based on federal changes to the actuarial value, I believe. Isn't that the reason? Something like that. Stay tuned. James will describe it in a moment. But we do have two very big deal discussion items. The first is an introduction from Katie Ravel to the different ways that a state-based subsidy may be structured. And when we get to that, and you'll hear more, we have been providing technical assistance to the legislature and the governor for many months, much of that in the form of the 1810 Advisory Committee, more recently providing technical assistance to the governor as he prepares and then submitted to the legislature that may revise. Between now and middle of June, there's going to be back and forth between the legislature and the governor. What we're presenting today is based on the governor's proposal, what that would look like, what that may look like in terms of potential subsidy, potential enrollment. Katie Ravel will present that. Second, we're presenting our proposed fiscal year budget. And as always, we know that we get a lot of material out at the last minute for this time, but this is a discussion item that we'll come back to act on and act for the board's action at the June meeting. I will note that we posted what is a 138 page. If you haven't read it all, shame on you. It was posted at 9:42 this morning. Just kidding, but it's there's a lot of good work here, and I look forward to hearing Dora Mejia, our CFO, introducing that in a little while. Again, those are discussion topics for action in June. Before going on to reviewing some of the press and reports, I want to note a small format change for folks here who give testimony and present to the board. You will see that the podium has been moved up, and it's now closer to the board. So you aren't tucked away in a corner. You're sitting very close to Jerry and other members of the board, rather than being so far away. We think that will be more intimate, more close, and you can actually engage the board members more directly. But this also means you line up someplace different. So if you plan on speaking, don't line up on the wall. Line up behind the first pillar here, right to the right of our General Counsel, Kathy Keeshan. Kathy, raise your hand. So there you go. Next to that pillar, that's where you line up. So I know this will be very disorienting. Many of you for years have lined up along the wall. Now the chair will be able to see you instead of saying, is there someone there or not? Because you'll be standing next to the pillar. So, pardon me? That is not a stool to stand on. Thank you. That is actually protection for underground wiring. Do not kick the stool to stand on. So you'll do fine if you're standing in front of that. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So a couple things on updates on the background material provided. First, on press materials, I want to note that two things are provided. First, on May 7th, Covered California with Washington and Massachusetts presented data on our first year open enrollment. We updated that on our renewal information. And it's really important because you all know, and this is reflected in our budget, but it's so important to flag that we shared our data that in California, for the 2019 open enrollment period, we saw a very large drop in new enrollment, a 24% decline in new enrollment. This happened across the nation, mostly. The state of Washington did analysis. They saw a 46% decline of new enrollment. An exception to that rule was Massachusetts, a state which has had a penalty in place for years, predating the Affordable Care Act, promoted the fact of that penalty in 2018, and saw a 31% increase in new enrollment. When we reported that, we were not able to report on what happened in renewal, because when people renew, the vast majority are what we call passive renewals. If they want to stay with their plan, they don't do anything. They just wait for their bill to come and then pay or do not pay their bill. We were concerned that the renewals would drop as well. We never thought they'd drop as much as new enrollment, but we were concerned. This press release shared the very, very positive data that in California, as well as in Massachusetts, as well as in Washington, once people get covered, coverage is sticky. They keep their coverage. So we saw in California an actual increase in our what we call effectuation rate. The number of people who pay their bill when they receive it went up to the highest rate we've ever seen, an 89% effectuation rate. That's very good news. It's good news because it relates, as you'll hear from Dora, on what it means for our projections for enrollment. It's good news because it means more Californians are covered. It's good news because it means that our efforts to promote enrollment through things such as having a penalty matter. But what matters more is people want insurance. And once they get insurance, they want to keep insurance. So that's one of the press reports identified here in our board material. The second is 2 days ago, the San Francisco Chronicle ran an op-ed that I drafted comparing, as I shared with the board a few meetings ago, the mandate to have health insurance with the requirement to wear a seatbelt. I spent a little time talking to the board a few months ago about that metaphor. I then wrote it up in an op-ed that was accepted by the Chronicle. And I would remind you that when you look nationally, 49 states have a requirement to wear a seatbelt. In those 49 states, the likelihood that consumers driving cars wear seatbelts is 90% or above, which means when they're in accidents, they're less likely to be harmed, less likely to die. The one state that does not have a requirement to wear a seatbelt is the state of New Hampshire, the live free or die state. In that state, the likelihood of drivers wearing a seatbelt is 70%, which means you're 3 times as more likely to be not wearing a seatbelt in New Hampshire, than you are in states that have a requirement. 3 times as likely to not be wearing a seatbelt. So this is the difference of where a penalty makes a difference to nudge and encourage people to do the right thing. The metaphor I used in the Chronicle is there are many good comparisons to having national standards for seatbelts, just as we now have national standards, and we have in California benefit design standards, so consumers can be sure they're getting a good health insurance coverage without needing to know all of the details of what's an excluded benefit, where's a maximum out-of-pocket kick in, all those things, just like none of us should expect we need to have an engineering degree to test if a seatbelt in a car we buy is going to hold us if we get in an accident. There are many parallels that I think are worth noting. Second, I would note, as always, our press material includes a range of reports and research published since our last board meeting, about 35 of them. I'm not going to review them all. I would highlight a handful, though. The first of them is a letter written by our medical director, Lance Lang, to the head of OSPED, the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, advising Mr. Calvert on considerations in embarking on an all-payer claims data set, which OSPED is looking at. I'll note that Isaac Menashe was with them today talking more about these issues. Data is a vital engine of improving healthcare quality, not just in Covered California, but throughout California. And having an effective all-payer claims data set would go a long way to making sure all Californians get the right care at the right time. We at Covered California have had a healthcare evidence initiative with all the data from all of our enrollees since they've started in 2014. But to really improve healthcare in California, you need everybody. You need data on everybody. And we did a letter that advised on the sorts of data attributes that would be critical to have. We are happy to be a very active participant in that process. Other reports include a report by the Kaiser Family Foundation on the individual insurance market in 2018 stabilizing. California analysis on what's happened here, including reports from the California Health Benefits Review Program on where Californians get coverage, from UCLA's Center on Health Policy on the impacts of potential policies in California, and also a range of national reports from a range of either academic, thought organizations, and different stakeholders, including Urban Institute, Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, Heritage Foundation, whole wide range. We believe it's important to Cover California to cast our net and look at the waterfront of commentary to make sure as we both shape our policies and inform others' policies, we understand what's happening around the nation. With that, I will note, and I forgot I have this slide, excuse me. This is our slide on new enrollments from the data we did with Washington and Massachusetts. The one thing I'll remind you of, and again, many of you were here when we talked about this earlier for this report, is in the years running up to 2019, California, Massachusetts, Washington had stayed relatively flat on the number of people newly signing up each year. In the federal marketplace states, they had seen a 40% decline in the prior 3 years. Those are people that have dropped out of coverage, but they've been priced out, or that didn't know about the coverage options. We saw our first major decline in new enrollment in 2019. Washington saw a big decline in 2019. Massachusetts did not. Again, on the renewals, as I noted, and this is phenomenally good news, the fact that we had a better effectuation rate than last year means that we actually are going into this year with about the same number we thought we would in our budget projections, about 1.5 million people. You hear about that from Dora. But this is an issue that's relevant far more than to our budget. It's relevant to all of our understanding the importance of the stickiness of insurance. People want insurance. A penalty isn't why people do or don't buy insurance. It's because it's not affordable. Penalties serve as a nudge for helping people get something that once they get it, they want, they keep. Next note, as I noted that in the closed session we talked about going into the negotiating period with our health plans. I want to note that besides those efforts, we've been working very actively to recruit Medi-Cal managed care plans to participate more actively in Covered California. Now, in many ways, LA Care, which is a publicly accountable plan serving Medi-Cal and other enrollees, is a public option in LA. LA Care has, I believe, close to 100,000 covered California enrollees. Having them as a competing option means the other carriers in LA have a good competitor providing good coverage at good prices. That's competition that holds all plans to account. We are looking right now and have a contract with Health Management Associates to assist other Medi-Cal plans around the state consider might they join Covered California and offer coverage in other regions of the state. On our nickel, we're paying Health Management Associates to help those plans consider joining in other areas where they do not currently offer coverage in our market while they do in Medi-Cal. So stay tuned. We do not believe, and I'm not, that any of this will come to fruition in 2020. 2020 is right around the corner with other uncertainties. This effort is to help them consider joining the market for 2021. We would not surprise any of our existing carriers with a new competitor coming out of left or right field. But we very much want to have good, robust competition, and we think the public plans that we have in California are very strong potential competitors to join the other plans we have throughout California. Finally, on state-federal policy, I am not going to talk much about state policies. I'm going to leave that to Katie in talking about the subsidy option we're looking at, with two exceptions. Is first, on the state front, I want to remind you that the work Covered California was directed and commissioned to do under the 1810 legislation to provide a menu of options to reduce costs for consumers, provide more subsidies, impacts of things like putting a penalty in place, things like reinsurance, et cetera, has been used as an important reference point for the legislature and the governor, as well as a tool nationally. We at Covered California think it's a core part of our role to provide independent, expert, technical advice to the legislature, to the governor, and to others in Congress. And we get requests regularly from members of Congress from both sides of the aisle to provide technical assistance. We are doing that now. We will continue to do that through not only the current budget process, but for months and years to come. We think it's a key thing we are able to do, and we relish that opportunity to do. One of the ways we do that is also to provide comment to the federal administration. Since our last board meeting, we submitted comments to Secretary Azar regarding consumer choice of the sale of individual products across state lines. There have been a range of initiatives proposed by the current administration that in many ways cause us grave concern that it's going backwards in terms of going to a period of time when insurance was opaque. Insurance often didn't cover what consumers needed. Insurance often screened people with pre-existing conditions from getting coverage, meaning premiums might be cheaper, but often cheaper at the price of less access for many Americans. We provided very specific comments in regard to this request, noting substantial concerns of allowing cross-state coverage when you have a state like California, which has robust consumer protections and a vibrant market of health plans playing in a way that puts consumers first, with common good benefit designs, with an attention to the delivery system, with designs where consumers know what they're choosing. And we noted the hazards of having products that would have far more variance, far more confusion, and many potential gaps in coverage. So if you're interested in reading that, we posted that. We submitted that letter on May 6th. We continue to seek to provide opportunities to comment to, again, both the federal administration, but also our elected officials here in California. With that, as always, we have an appendix to the report on a range of issues that I will not speak to. But I would end there to see if the board has questions before we see if there's any public comment on the executive director's report before we turn to the open session on policy and action items. Mr. Acting Chair.
Well, I think, on the heels of the budget, it's exciting, looking forward to the next presentation, but really setting California up to continue to be a leader for the state. And I think what we're hearing from states like Washington and others are we're onto something good, and to continue building upon that. It's exciting to think about the work with other public plans in other counties to keep that competitive edge going. I know LA Care, it's 100,000 members of nearly 2 million, but it's a very meaningful product, and it keeps, I think, keeps us honest in some of these big regions. So that's all good news to hear.
Thanks, Brian. And we will absolutely keep you posted on that. And again, I want to appreciate there's, 4 of the Medi-Cal plans we've been in very active discussions with. They are interested. Not surprisingly, it's a challenge for them because it's a different, so to speak, line of business. And what they've said, we've reached out and worked with many of them since day one, is our core job is let's make sure the Medi-Cal expansion, which happened over the last 4 years, and the expansion of many of them serving dual eligibles, a particularly complex population, they've all said, let's do that right first, and then they'll look at expansion. We've been very happy with the engagement of LA Care. 100,000 is a lot of lives, but it's 5% of their total enrollment, given their 2 million lives overall, and they do, again, I think, help keep the other plans honest. Not that any of our plans are dishonest. They keep them competing robustly, I should say. So, any other board members?
No? Public comment?
Great. Hearing none and I will remind the folks watching on the phone that we always welcome comments by phone, and that's posted on our website that you can call in, and we'll keep an eye on calls coming in. So the first item is the one action item on the agenda, which is a very small revision to our patient-centered benefit designs. The one thing that I would note, and I'm not going to take all of James's thunder, but is we are doing very, very small revisions in terms of our 2020 benefit designs. But one of the things that I'll be calling out when we talk about our budget is we are looking forward to 2021 being a much bigger year for changes. In particular, we're looking at the potential of having pilot programs with substantial parts of the state benefiting from value-based designs that build on the already really good benefit designs we have, to potentially have areas of the state where people with chronic conditions would have no co-pays for particular drugs, office visits, et cetera. So that's an issue that we'll be embarking on, planning for very shortly, engaging our many partners, advocates on how to do that. But this is about what's happening right around the corner for 2020. James.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to try and move through here quickly, given how much we have to discuss later on today. If I can get the clicker to move. I might need someone else to click through for me. Oh, let's see. Okay, looks like it's working now. Maybe not. Go to the next slide if you can. Anyway, every year the federal government issues what they call a payment notice that sets the limits for what you can have for maximum out-of-pocket and other aspects of benefit design. They typically offer, or they have a draft, and then a few months later they have a final payment notice. This year the cycle was a bit longer than usual or later than usual, so we had the draft out earlier, we established our benefit designs, and the final notice came after the board approved the benefit designs in March. Typically the requirements in the letter are the same between the draft and the final, but in this case it was slightly different due to a change in methodology. The difference that we want to focus on here is that the maximum out-of-pocket went down by $50. So we have to change 10 of our plans, maximum out-of-pocket, reduce it by $50 to be in compliance. I have 11 up here. The 11th one is a little bit different. I'll get to that later. And when we did this, it turned out that our 2 gold plans on the individual market, because the maximum out-of-pocket went down a little bit, their actuarial value went up a little bit, which went over the limit. So now we had to change a different aspect of the benefit design to get that actuarial value back down. So the one that we felt was least disruptive was to increase the cost of a specialist office visit in those plans by $5. So that's a recommendation for those 10 or 2 plans, however you want to look at it. Then we have the bronze high deductible plan, which is a complex issue we raised a couple months ago. And we still don't have a final resolution. We have worked towards that effort. But in order to keep from having to bring this to you every month until a final resolution, we are proposing to set the deductible at $6,900. This would be the maximum out of pocket as well. This is what a lot of analysts expect the IRS to ultimately land on. However, in case this is different, if in case the IRS issues something different, or in case we have to make an adjustment, we're going to add this footnote or this end note to this benefit design. And it says, the bronze high deductible health plan is contingent upon meeting the actuarial value requirements in state law. This is something that the state is trying to change in order to make it possible for us to offer this benefit. The out-of-pocket maximum in the bronze high deductible health plan shall be equal to the maximum out-of-pocket limit established by the IRS or specified by the IRS in its revenue procedure for the 2020 calendar year for inflation-adjusted amounts for high deductible health plans linked to health savings accounts. Okay, and you've got the section number there. So I think this will resolve the question as to what the benefit design should be. We think for the high deductible health plan, $6,900 will be the proper amount, and we won't have to bring it back to you if it actually has to be changed by $50 or whatever in future months. This next page is I'm going 2 pages at a time. This next page is a summary of everything except the high deductible health plan issue, because that was a little bit more complex. We covered on the previous page, but if you want to look at it in tabular form, here's your opportunity. And with that, I'm open to any questions you may have.
You need to see if there's anything else.
So are there any questions or comments from board members? If not, can I hear a motion?
Move it.
And a second?
I'll second.
Okay.
So
And
before voting, we take a public comment.
right. So we now want to hear any public comment?
And remember, you don't line up back there, you line up by the pillar over here.
But she did
It's going
not-
to be very hard training. I know, this is going to get tough, but it'll get, so, perfect, right there, right
We
there.
were, well, yeah, Beth Capel, Health Access California. We are always happy when the maximum out-of-pocket is lower. We're never happy when the copay is higher. But we acknowledge the need to make adjustments. We are pleased to say that the Senate Budget Subcommittee is this afternoon adopting the necessary language to allow you to proceed with the high deductible health plan in the bronze, so that we hope that by the time this is resolved in the legislative process over the next few weeks, that the end note will accurately reflect what California law is, and we are pleased to sponsor that. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Jen Flory on behalf of Western Center on Law and Poverty. And first of all, welcome, Secretary Ghali. And I just want to echo what Beth was saying, that we appreciate the transparency of the staff and the circumstances that they were working under with, final federal amounts coming out very late this year. And we think we've really made the best of the situation that we can. And so we're just happy for the continued work.
If I could, the only thing that I'd want to add is I really want to thank both the health plans, but in particular the advocacy community, Health Access, for sponsoring this legislation. We don't take positions on legislation. This was a fix that needed to happen. We were caught between the required changes given the federal rules and standards and the state legislation, which we were working with. And this is an example of not only us as an organization working nimbly, but also advocates that we've worked with, understanding how important this issue is. So I want to offer my thanks to those folks who have recognized the need to address this issue.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Mark?
Aye.
And the chair is aye. Passes unanimously.
Thank you very much. Next item is on market stabilization affordability proposal. I'd like to have Katie Ravel come up. I already introduced this broadly when I talked about the agenda. The couple things that I want to just underscore is we have right now a proposal from the governor reflected in the May revise. This is now in the hands of the legislature, and the legislature with the governor. We need to be ready because under any circumstance, both of those elected bodies understand the urgency that if we want to affect 2020, which is right around the corner, this needs to be wrapped up in June. Both it has implications for our budget. Far more importantly, it has implications for consumers in California. And there's going much beyond June, system-wise, promotion-wise, et cetera. We can't make the difference that we know this would have. So I really am very appreciative of the legislature, the governor, understanding the importance and sensitivity. I also want to note my incredible thanks and appreciation for our team at Cover California and the extended team. This is where Katie Ravel, Isaac Menashe, but also our contracted consultants like Wes Yin, providing expert advice, revising, redoing work again and again. John Burtko, James DeBenedetti, people in plan management, Dora Mejia, people in finance have been working very hard, recognizing that these are very, very complex issues. What we're doing here is trying to provide you with the best picture possible of where things are today, and given where they are today, how things will look for consumers, recognizing we need and will have a process to, in the next weeks, engage stakeholders and others to refine what comes out of the legislature to be a final process coming back to the board. With that, Ms. Ravel, take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, board members. Peter did remind us that we started our affordability work last year with our AB 1810 Affordability Work Group, which I was pleased to chair, an excellent engagement with stakeholders, our carriers, and our association partners. We talked a lot about a few affordability problems in that group, and one is illustrated here. That's the subsidy cliff at 400% of the federal poverty level where federal tax credits stop. So you can see how as consumers' income grows up to 400%, they pay more and more of their income, or more and more of the premium costs as tax credits taper off and then end at 400% of the federal poverty level. And we know that the tax credit structure that's in place today accounts for key differences in premiums such as age, which is displayed on this slide. We also talked quite a bit about the impact on top of premiums that cost sharing has, and we talked particularly about individuals at 200% of the federal poverty level and above. At 200%, the federal cost sharing reductions taper significantly and then end at 250% of the federal poverty level. So as Peter said, we have been providing technical assistance on a variety of proposals, and we just summarize here. Governor Newsom's fiscal year budget proposes to reinstate the individual mandate and penalty and offer premium subsidies to individuals between 200 and 600% of the federal poverty level. And there are several bills that have been introduced in the legislature that would also reinstate the mandate and penalty and improve affordability through premium subsidies and or cost-sharing subsidies. The technical assistance we've been providing has leveraged our affordability, our 1810 affordability work, and that infrastructure that we built to provide modeling. We've also provided quite a bit of feedback on program design considerations, and I just bucket them in three big categories, which is, in order to launch in 2020, we've been very clear that we need to mirror the federal subsidy structure. We don't have time to have differences in rules. As much as we've talked about the impact of cost-sharing subsidies, we did not believe that they could be implemented for 2020 given the benefit design time horizon that we have. And as Peter mentioned, we've said that legislation must be passed in June so that we can get any of the proposals factored into the 2020 premium rates and programmed into our system in time for launch. The rest of the presentation will largely focus on the May revision proposal and the technical assistance we provided there, but I think the policy and operational issues that we'll talk about today will be relevant regardless of whatever the ultimate budget decision is and the enacted budget of the state. So I'll just call out a few components, which is The governor's proposal would reinstate the individual mandate and the penalty prior to the way it was when it was zeroed out for 2019. The penalty revenue would be used to provide additional premium subsidies for individuals between 200 and 400%, and new subsidies for individuals between 400 and 600% of the federal poverty level who don't qualify today. Consumers would have to, as they do today, would have to purchase through Cover California and otherwise meet our eligibility requirements, with the exception of income, to receive state subsidies. So these are things like citizenship and immigration status requirements, the requirement that you can't have other affordable minimum essential coverage, and the like. Similar to the federal subsidies, they would be advanceable, and the administration's proposal is that the subsidies would also be reconciled at the end of the year through the Franchise Tax Board. The California penalty, I would note, would be permanent, but would be offset if the federal penalty was reinstated. And the state financial assistance program is proposed to sunset at the end of 2022. Just to give you a sense here of the sort of income range we're talking about, for individuals, it would be folks making between $50,000 and $75,000 a year, and for a family of four, about $100,000 to $150,000. And we have all the additional cut points for reference. Went too far. I'll talk a little bit about the program design cycle that's envisioned in the proposal. First, the Franchise Tax Board would estimate individual mandate penalty revenue through the state budget process. Under the proposal, the Department of Finance would then provide Cover California parameters for the program, including the required use of the funding. For 2020, it would be premium subsidies. The subsidy spending target for the budget year and the out year, so the total budget, and the allocation of funding for above and below 400% of the federal poverty level. The board, then Cover California's board, would then adopt a program design in accordance with those budget targets, which we would then transmit to the director of the Department of Finance, who would approve the proposal following notification to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. This is a display of what's in the administration's proposal. The proposal calls for $295 million in state general fund for premium subsidies in 2020 due to the lag in penalty revenues. Penalty revenues wouldn't come in until 2021, so the state general fund would provide the payment in 2020. And they're directing 75% to be allocated to individuals above 400% of the federal poverty level. We would note that subsidies would have to be adjusted in coverage years 2021 and 2022 to maintain a budget-neutral program over the 3-year time horizon. So the revenues that you see on the top line were provided by the Franchise Tax Board. That's their estimate of penalty revenues. And then the expenditures are what Cover California would spend in subsidies in the 3 years of the program. And you can see that it achieves budget neutrality over the lifetime of the 3 years. Let's have just a little reminder on the federal tax credit methodology today. So these are the projected 2020 federal required contributions. Those won't be finalized by the Internal Revenue Service for a month or so, but this is our projection. So as a reminder, these set the amount of income that a consumer has to pay towards a benchmark plan, the second lowest silver plan, before the federal tax credit kicks in. We talk affectionately about the curve off to the right on the chart. Just translates into dollars what that means. So for someone under 133% of the federal poverty level, that could be a benchmark plan cost of between $20 and $30, rising with income to between about $300 and $400 at the higher end of the subsidy scale. And then we do note that the current tax credit cliff is at 400% of the federal poverty level. This next chart overlays the federal curve with a new proposed state curve, and this is based on the budget parameters from the administration's proposal, $295 million, and the allocation above and below 400% of the federal poverty level. We will talk a little bit more in the next slide about some of the dynamics here, but we start at 200% of the federal poverty level at the proposed federal value, rises up to about 10%. You reach about 17% of income at 450% of federal poverty, and then it rises up to 25% at 600% of FPL. Let's talk a little bit about the dynamics here. So we've talked about the funding split above and below 400, and the curve is designed to put 75% of the money above 400%. I'll note sort of the distinction in budget exposure above and below 400%. I'll just jump back a slide here. Below 400%, the cost is really between that yellow line and the blue line, which would be the state cost, is a percentage of people's income. When you go over 400%, the state tax credit would then function like the federal tax credit, where it would pick up any difference over that required contribution cap. So while under 400%, state expenditures would grow very slowly, perhaps just 1% a year. Over 400%, they would grow much more rapidly, as they would pick up the increase in premium costs year over year. Oh, went too fast. So just for a simple example, a premium that's $1,000 in the first year that rises by 10% and becomes $1,100 the next year. If a tax credit was $100 in the first year and it picked up the entire difference, it would double to become $200 in the second year. So it grows much more quickly above 400%. We understand that the administration's desire would be for us to control out-year cost growth so that the amount of subsidy that an individual receives would grow, would be sort of steady over time. I think in order for us to do that, we would have to effectuate it by raising those contribution caps in the second and the third year of the program. And then I just have a few notes about the shape of the curve, linear versus cliffs, and interaction with the federal and state curves. And I'll talk a little bit about that here with the red circles. So in the first circle at 200% of the federal poverty level, we have those two curves tied together. That, I would say, on the one hand, that makes it so that you preserve the sliding scale of income so that you have people continuing to pay more as their income grows. On the other hand, that will mean that there will be very small values of state subsidy at that point. You'll also have very small values at 400% of FPL. We could look at having sort of breaks in the curve. It would mean that people at 200% or just a little bit above would be paying less as a required contribution than people just below. That might be something that you'd want to consider, though, given the fact that at 200% consumers have far less cost sharing. At the second node I would talk about is 400%. We have a bend in the curve there. We do not have a cliff. You could imagine that we could have a jump up around that point to another 12% or something around there, which would obviously be a discontinuity for consumers. I think what we have here is very progressive, right above 400% FPL, but it comes at a trade-off of what I think we would call a very high cap at 25%, at 25% of income at 600% of FPL. So I think those are trade-offs that the board can consider. We'll look forward to discussion on that and discussion with our stakeholder partners. I would just note that any changes in the curve will require trade-offs somewhere else along the curve. So I'll give you a few summary numbers here. Our technical assistance on the governor's proposal shows that about 850,000 Californians would be eligible to receive a state subsidy. That's about 660,000 below 400% of FPL and about 190,000 above. Of the 660, that's over 500,000 who are with Cover California today and then new enrollment. Above 400%, you would have some who are buying with us today, some who would switch from off exchange to take advantage of the new subsidies, and then some new enrollment incentivized by either the new subsidies or the penalty. Average household subsidies would be around $13 under 400%, around $144 above 400%, but averages are tricky, and we'll go into some more detailed scenarios in the next couple of slides. We're showing a cost of about $294 million total, with about $73 million being spent below 400 and the balance above 400. New enrollment is also broken out there. It's a subtotal of the 850,000. And we would note that we're projecting, we've projected that this could cause a decrease in premium growth of between 4 and 8%. And just one final note that an additional 45,000 Californians we would expect to purchase coverage, but to do that off exchange. So returning to some of our good old scenarios from the 1810 work, here's Aaron and Francis, a 62-year-old couple living in a high-cost region with an income of $72,000. Translates to about 425% of the federal poverty level, would pay over 40% of their income for a benchmark plan. Currently, this would, under the proposal that we've modeled for the governor's proposal, would drop to about 13% of income with a state subsidy of about $1,600 per month. We then show, let's see if I can do it, we then show Alfonso at about 275% of the federal poverty level. His required contribution would drop about a percentage point and would receive about $20 a month in state subsidies. Okay, I will go slowly with these. So we want to illustrate a few dynamics here about the credit, particularly how it functions around age, region, and income. On the first slide, we're making the point that age matters. So here we have on the left side the gross premium for a 40-year-old, which of course I can't read, it's $500 and something, and the gross premium for a 60-year-old, about $1,600 a month. You can see that because the required contribution sort of protects the individual at 60 more than the individual at 40. So you'll see that state tax credit is sort of bigger, and it moves up the income scale more significantly for an older individual. Here's a similar look illustrating that the region matters. So we have Alameda on the left, a relatively higher cost region, and Los Angeles on the right, with the same dynamic that the required contribution does more in Alameda County, where the premiums are higher. So you'll see that state tax credit is bigger in Alameda for the same age consumer, 55 in both scenarios, and goes higher up the income scale than it would in a lower cost region like Los Angeles. Slightly different way to display it. We have all of our regions on this chart, and we show that at a particular FPL, we picked 451% here, where the required contribution cap is about 17% of their income. You can see sort of the regions where that required contribution is tripped and there would be state subsidies, and the ones where premiums actually fall below that required contribution amount. Finally, here's showing the impact as income rises. So the gray bars show the consumer's income. It rises, so it's an increase in the federal poverty level. The orange line on the left side shows the required contribution today in the current state. So for a 60-year-old, right over 400%, you're spending something like 30% of income, if I can read that correctly. Under the proposal that we've provided technical assistance for, that would drop significantly. It would drop closer to 10%. But those drops will look different depending on the cost of the region and the age. Let's move to a second component of the proposal, which is the reconciliation of the advanced subsidies. So the administration's proposal would require consumers to reconcile the subsidies they receive. This is very similar to what consumers do with a federal subsidy. The federal reconciliation adjusts the consumer's final tax credit against what they receive throughout the year. Through federal reconciliation, then some consumers may owe if they've underprojected their income, or they may receive a refund. I would just remind us that the federal tax credit lowers the consumer's monthly bill, but the payment is actually made from the federal government to the health plans, and we'll come back to this later in the slides. So the reconciliation at year end adjusts the total premium paid by the consumer versus the share that's paid by the federal government. The reconciliation, the federal government does have reconciliation caps, so repayment is capped for individuals whose year-end income is at or below 400% of the federal poverty level. But consumers who exceed 400% must repay the entire amount of the credit. That's part of the cliff. A couple important dynamics when you combine a state credit and a federal credit under the current proposal. Adding a state premium subsidy above 400% will create large reconciliation flows as consumers shift above and below 400% of the federal poverty level. So in the first example, a consumer would shift from 390%, that would be the income, not that anyone projects that percentage, but that would be based on the income they applied with. And their final year-end income would come in actually at 410%. So the consumer would owe back a significant federal premium subsidy, but would be owed a state subsidy. Without reconciliation, that federal tax cliff would still exist for the consumer who would end the year over 400. And then on the flip side, if a consumer went from 410 to 390, the consumer would owe back California tax credit, but would owe back state tax credit, but the federal government would owe them an even larger credit. And without reconciliation, the consumer would be able to keep that state credit and also claim the refund of the federal credit. So these are dynamics we're looking at as we're advising on what reconciliation caps could be, which is a component of what the board would adopt under the administration's proposal. So we will present recommended caps at the June board meeting. In developing those caps, we'll consider the federal cap structure and the relationship of what the caps are to what the average premiums are and different metrics around that. We'll also look at extending the cap beyond 600% of FPL to mitigate the impact of the new state cliff. And we look forward to engagement with our AB 1810 work group on this point. Okay, we'll now move to the individual mandate. The mandate would require, similar to the federal mandate, would require California residents to enroll in and maintain minimum essential coverage or receive an exemption or pay a penalty. Generally mirrors the federal mandate and penalty with the adjustments for California's higher filing threshold and a few other adjustments that are needed for a state-level penalty. The Franchise Tax Board will collect the penalty through the income tax system, and Covered California would grant certain exemptions from the mandate, and Franchise Tax Board would grant additional exemptions through the tax filing process. Covered California's role in the administration's proposal would be twofold. One, to administer hardship exemptions and exemptions for religious conscience. Hardship exemptions include financial hardship and other life circumstances that would prevent a consumer from obtaining coverage. They can be granted throughout the year and entitle a consumer to purchase a catastrophic plan if desired. The other component is outreach. So the administration's proposal would require the Franchise Tax Board to share data with Covered California for individuals who either paid the penalty or received an exemption, and Covered California would do outreach to those individuals to encourage them to take coverage. So I'll move now to the board's role in establishing the premium subsidy program, which is the program design document, and you have a copy of this in your packet. The proposal would require the board to adopt the document each year. For 2020, the document has to establish the eligibility levels and reconciliation caps to meet the budget target. This draft is being presented today. We look forward to having discussions with stakeholders over the next several weeks to be in a position to adopt it at the June board meeting as appropriate, assuming the budget is enacted with this proposal. Here's an overview of the document. It is a technical document. It looks sort of like program regulations. It has 5 main components. It establishes the required contribution amounts, and those are the amounts that we saw on those curves that meet the budget targets. It establishes the calculation for the credit, which is the same as the federal credit, taking the consumer's required contribution less the gross premium, except we account for the fact that there will be federal tax credits for individuals under 400% of FPL. It establishes eligibility requirements, and we have said that those will mirror the federal premium tax credit requirements with the exception of that federal income limit. It defines key terms, and it sets up a framework for reconciliation caps, although I've noted that we're still working on what those caps would be. Let me talk a little bit about operational considerations, and Peter mentioned some of these. So we know that we have to finalize rates in early July and transmit them to the regulators. program parameters, if we want the rates to factor in the impact of these policies, that needs to be done in late June and early July. And we have been coordinating with our carriers and with state regulators on the timing of these issues. Our next main consideration is our system development cycle. So to be ready to deliver this program, we're sort of tracking 3 key areas. One is eligibility determinations, which we would need to begin making in October for the 2020 plan year. The second is carrier payments to the carriers of the state premium subsidy, which we're planning to begin in the first quarter of 2020. And then the final is reconciliation of the state subsidies, which would begin in the first quarter of 2021. And one consideration around monitoring expenditures. The administration's proposal is not an entitlement, so Covered California has to be prudent in setting eligibility levels. That said, should expenditures exceed program funding, there is a provision that would allow Covered California to request an augmentation of funding during a benefit year. We would just note that supplemental appropriations would likely be deducted from future years' program budgets. Last slide. Key milestones and next steps. So we've discussed a lot about the technical assistance we provided to the administration's proposal, which was released last Thursday. We're at the board meeting today. We've discussed the draft program design document. As I mentioned, we would like to reconvene the AB 1810 Affordability Advisory Group sometime in the week of May 27th or June 3rd. We'd like to talk about that program design document, particularly the required contribution and the reconciliation caps. Our qualified health plan negotiations are going on in June. June 15th, the deadline for the legislature to pass the budget bill. We would then like to reconvene for a second time the 1810 work group the week of June 17th, assuming that a proposal includes, assuming that the final budget includes funding for this proposal. We could talk a little bit about the trade-offs and how we would set up those required contribution curves. Then hopefully to be back June 26th with a final presentation in the program design document. And then you can just see the other sort of regular open enrollment milestones we have. 4, we would welcome public participation, so we just note here the website for where we'll share information about meetings, and then we're welcome to take, we're happy to take feedback through policy@coveredca.gov on this entire proposal. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Let me add a couple things. First, I want to do a huge call out of thanks to Katie, who's just done with her team a phenomenal job. What she's run through in the last 20 slides reflect 8 billion hours of work, 700 reattempts at calculating things, et cetera. 4 things that I would just highlight or just sort of call out is, one, it is not the job of this board or Covered California to set the overall policy. The issues of the dollar amount, the split, sunset or not, is for the legislature and the governor to decide. And they're in those discussions right now. I would note that one of the issues that's in discussion is the whole issue about a sunset. And 2 things I'd call out. A sunset doesn't mean it does sunset, because the legislature could consider at any point to continue it. And in particular, there are pieces of federal legislation in discussion today to address the cliff at a federal level. One of the first things the governor did when he took office, day one, was to send a letter to not just the president, but to the Congress, saying the ACA should be built upon and improved, including addressing federally the need to have a penalty, and including addressing the needs of middle-class Americans across the country who right now need the help that this proposal is addressing in California. So part of the issues of a sunset is if there's a federal subsidy that takes its place before the sunset, that would take place first, and whatever would be a delta would be picked up by this, but that's one thing on the sunset. Second, I wanted to note that in what's been public from the the administration is a somewhat different number of the subsidy. I want to be clear that the numbers you heard here as averages are household averages. What the governor's office has spoken of is individual subsidy amounts. An individual getting a subsidy of about $100 translates to the dollars you saw here from Katie of a household subsidy of about $144. It's the exact same number. It just means that the average household in covered California has a child who is 0.44% of a child. Third, Katie noted the issue around development and timing in June. We are already doing work today to be ready to have policies take effect in 2020. And you'll hear when Dora speaks about budget issues for covered California of incurring costs, in particular for CalHERS, the IT system, to determine eligibility. I'd note all of those efforts are anchored in the absolute key element in this time frame to have them based on the federal structures. That's why it's so relatively easy, and you'll hear in the budget how relatively inexpensive it is to do that. If it were other alternate things, it would take longer and cost more. Fourth, the note around caps above 600. And this is one of the things I really have appreciation for what the governor's team has been willing for us as a state to look at is today, if a consumer, and Katie noted this, gets a subsidy because they're at 395% of poverty, that subsidy may be for $6,000. If and it's something they didn't anticipate, they do a little better, they get a bonus they didn't anticipate, and their income goes to 401%. They must pay 100% of that subsidy received back to the IRS. We get appeals to us on that issue of consumers saying, what do you mean I have to pay back $7,000? I only made $800 more, and I've got to pay $6,000 back. That's the law. That's the federal law. And the fact that California, the state, is looking at having something different from that would incrementally say, if you make a little bit over 600, you've got to pay something back, but maybe not the entire amount. And that's one of the things that, Katie, I wanted to put the fleshing out what that means is the cliff being a cliff that falls to 100% of nothing has stark implications for consumers. And trying to think through how to do that differently is important. The final thing I want to note is to Katie's last slide, and actually turn back to one slide if you don't mind, Katie. No, go forward one more. There you go. I want to be very clear when the mechanism for Covered California requests a funding augmentation. We at Covered California get no funds under this. This is to augment the amount of resources able to be given in subsidies to consumers through their health plans to reduce their premium. And what I want to note is that the augmentation would be the budget you've seen proposed by the governor, which would be altered by whatever comes out of the legislative process, is $295 million. As we go through the year, we might see, wow, many more people have signed up than we thought. It looks like we will need $360 million. We didn't get it exactly right. That's what this is talking about, us needing to go back to be able to augment that money so we don't say, sorry, you thought you were getting a subsidy for the entire year, you only get it through October. Or sorry, you signed up too late, you don't get one. And so that's what the mechanism is referring to. And I want to be very clear that this whole program, Covered California, is still 100% funded on the assessments of the premiums. What we are talking about funding is giving more real dollars in premium assistance to Californians. So with that, I'd turn it to the board first for questions of Katie, and then we'll turn it for public comment.
This is quite a piece of work here. I have to say it's very impressive, and so there's about 1,000 questions I have, but I wanted to just get clear on one thing. You talked about over time. There's the issue of as healthcare costs go up, and over time you might have to make adjustments on what the caps are in terms of percent of income. Was that in regard to in the first 3 years, or was that in regard to years beyond 3?
In the first 3 years.
Oh, it is.
Yes. So the second and third year, we might have to make adjustments. The administration has talked about having a credit that's sort of tracks and grows a little bit based on the average credit, so the $10 and the $100. That might grow a little bit year over year, but it might not cover the full increase in premiums in the second year and the third year of the program.
Well, as we look at that, we just have to consider that remember that, we have to remember that most people don't understand when they sign up for Covered California that they've gotten a subsidy. And so when they go from year to year, they'll see that change as just a larger rate increase.
That's
and
right.
so being able to, as we look at that, beginning to say, okay, then let's just run some, as you had examples here, have examples saying, well, if we did this, this means that somebody who had a certain rate would be getting, with underlying inflation at 7% or something like that, they'll be getting a rate increase of 23 or something, not that big, but anyway, but that'll be an important way for us to look at it.
Absolutely.
Could you, I think it's really important, I think Katie described this, is that under 400% of poverty, generally, the federal subsidied work that consumers are shielded from those 6, 7, 8% premium increases. They're protected because it's tied to their income level. What it means for over the 400%, in this structure, it wouldn't be a 23%, but it would be, they'd be feeling a 7% increase, and they wouldn't be protected from that. But that's, right now, they're paying the 7% with no help at all. So I think, but it is not having a comparable, being shielded from the premium increases of healthcare in the above 400. And number two, and it's very important, though, your observation that consumers do not understand, by and large, they look at their bottom line. They're saying, I'm paying this much. They forget pretty quick that some of it's covered by a tax credit versus some isn't. So I think that, it is absolutely the case that those over 400, if you aren't applying a mechanism to keep the overall cost down, will be bearing the full cost largely of premium increases they would have borne anyway without the offset of the subsidy.
Well, I think they may be increasing, might even because of the fact that incomes don't go up as fast as healthcare costs, they'd actually be going up faster than healthcare costs. And so just the math would tend to work out that way. So that the question is just to remember when we start talking about moving these caps and things like that, we have to put them in the eyes of the consumer about what they would expect, realizing that they will see that, oh, I've signed up for Covered California, and I got a 10% increase or something like that. And yes, it's not going to be probably our solution isn't going to be as good as the way the federal one works over time, but we need to be pretty aware of that as we actually look at it, because it's hard to abstract that little curve to what happens to real people. So that's important.
Any other board member comments, questions? Okay, with that, we're going to turn to public and I guess start with Beth.
Turn the mic off. Beth Capel for Health Access California. We want to begin by appreciating the work that the AB 1810 work group did and your staff has done in this area, and to say how very much we appreciate that we're in the middle of having a discussion about improving affordability. And that we appreciate the administration's proposal to improve affordability and to have an individual mandate. And that in the process of that conversation with the legislature, we have conveyed to the legislature that we have long had a good working relationship with Covered California and trust the competence of the FTB to implement their part of this. Having said that, we did not think the January budget, which was funded at $500 million a year, was adequately funded. We regard this proposal as severely underfunded. We had difficulty defending a proposal that required people to pay more than 10% of their income for premiums, even if that was better than the current reality. To face a proposal that caps premiums at 20 to 25% of income is quite astonishing to us. There are simply not sufficient funds in this proposal. To compound it by indicating that if there is an overspending of a new program, that we would deduct the amount and thus make this even worse from a consumer perspective is to us extremely troubling. And Peter, I'm going to run over my time because it is 20 slides and kind of a big proposal here. We regard the amount of help for those under 400% as quite insufficient. $10 a month is not very much for somebody making $36,000 or $40,000 a year. And the refusal to provide help to people below 200% of poverty is also extremely troubling to us. We have Californians who are in the Medi-Cal income range that are spending $25 to $30 a month for premiums, who, if they were eligible for Medi-Cal, would have zero premiums. It is perplexing to us, the refusal to help lower-income Californians. We are further perplexed that we would sunset the affordability help but not the mandate. They're both complicated new proposals at the state level. If we're going to sunset one, we should sunset the other. We are also troubled that the proposal insists on tax reconciliation for for people getting $10 a month, but doesn't require refunds of the mandate. That also strikes us as perplexing. And we will, as we have all along, participate in good faith in the discussion while we continue to advocate for more adequate funding, because the proposal before you is troubling. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Jen Flory on behalf of Western Center on Law and Poverty. And as you'll know from our name, Poverty, we represent the people who've been excluded from this proposal. I reiterate a lot of what Beth says. We were also proud participants in the AB 1810 Affordability Work Group, and one of the biggest takeaways for us from that work group was money spent at the lower end results in huge take-up rates, much greater than money spent at the higher end of the income scale. What that means is that increases enrollment and that increases the market overall, which can bring down premiums for everybody. While we do not deny that middle-class people need additional assistance, even when you look at the very sympathetic example of Francis and Aaron, the 60% they have left in their income after paying that huge 40% on healthcare is still well over 10 grand more than the households at 200% and below. So when we're judging how affordable something is, we should judge it by not how much assistance someone has been given, but whether they're able to pay for the other necessities of life after paying for rent and things like that. And we're finding that people below 200% of the federal poverty level, as well as data on consumer reporting, has shown that people who are getting the cost-sharing reductions and people who are getting the subsidies still report the same difficulty in accessing care as people who aren't eligible for that. So that to us says that more affordability help is needed across the board. Now, we understand that Cover California's role is not to set the state budget and is not to advocate in the legislature, but we do think you have a gold mine of data that was done with the AB 1810 work group that explains why more help across the board would actually do greater help for the market overall and help everybody, including the low-income people. And then finally, on the individual mandate, we are having real difficulty with the idea that the individual mandate would be newly imposed on people who were the most of the households paying the mandate previously were households below 200% of the federal poverty level. So when you are taking money from people and giving it to someone else, and you're moving it from lower income households to higher income households, we do have a term for that, and we usually call that a reverse Robin Hood. So we don't want any policy that would do this, and we all need to come together to get the legislature and the governor to understand that this is well worth doing, but it's well worth doing right so we get the most bang for our buck. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Carrie Sanders with the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network. Welcome, Secretary Ghali, to your first meeting. Exciting to see you here. I just want to appreciate Cover California's analysis and discussion of the nuances of the governor's May revised proposal. However, I think as others noted, the governor's proposal is still a proposal. The current May revised proposal is much more generous to those above 400% of the federal poverty level and less so to those below 400%. And as Beth and Jen mentioned, $10 a month is a lot different and goes a lot further. It doesn't go far enough for folks who are really struggling with other bills. In terms of Cover California's own analysis, we know from the January report that really providing subsidies and additional financial assistance to folks below 400% can really move the needle, can really improve enrollment in those, to Covered California. And you can see that from the analysis itself when you look at helping potentially 660,000 people versus 190,000 people. You can see that there's a much greater potential to increase enrollment at those lower numbers. We appreciate Covered California's position that it doesn't set policy regarding California's budget decisions, but it can influence discussions around what's best for consumers. And that's what we're asking you to do. The Assembly, we understand, is considering potentially providing additional affordability help, and we would like to see an analysis of what that would actually look like in Covered California and for those consumers. And we're disappointed that we didn't see that today, but we hope to see that moving forward. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Alicia Kalk with the National Health Law Program. We want to thank Covered California for engaging in this work. Although we understand that your role at this juncture is providing technical assistance, we're deeply concerned that the population under 200% of the federal poverty level is left out of the draft state premium assistance program design. I'd like to echo the comments of my colleague Jen Flory of Western Center on Law and Poverty. And without this additional assistance, low-income individuals and families will opt out of coverage and be left behind. We have to remember that these are individuals and families that every day are choosing between putting a roof over their heads and or feeding their children and having health care. Just one more note that as co-chair of Covered California's Marketing Outreach and Enrollment Assistance Advisory Group, should new state subsidies be put into place, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of coming up with effective marketing outreach and enrollment. And I do hope that we'll be able to work with you before the August meeting to get that started. Thank you.
Chairs, members of the board, Mark Herbert with Small Business Majority, and really appreciate the governor's proposal, the thoughtful work that Covered California staff has put into analyzing that proposal. We know from small businesses here in California that 70% of California small businesses support both ensuring that folks have to purchase insurance through the individual mandate, and 70% of California small businesses support ensuring that affordability is significantly increased. So we are thankful for this innovative and exciting approach to ensure that more small business owners in Covered California can access insurance. We do want to echo comments made by speakers before that we are concerned about the robustness of those subsidies to make a meaningful impact to employers and their employees. So we appreciate the analysis, we appreciate the engagement. We'll be encouraging the legislature to increase the affordability that is available, and we look forward to continuing to work with Covered California as the analyses are done on what might be possible. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the board? The one of the, thank you very much for that comment. And again, we will and stand ready and will be assisting the legislature as they come to us, and the governor as things move along. And again, I'd note that we shared and again, this is where volunteers get volunteered again. The good work of the 1810 committee is a group we will turn to again. It's a good cross-section of advocates, plans. It is a group that brings actuarial and other expertise to bear and looks at issues through a value lens, which is incredibly important. I'd note that our tradition is to have actions before acted on by the board be considered by the board in open session. This is that first open session. Action will need to be taken next meeting on something we don't know what it is right now, because it's going to be the product of the legislature and the governor working together. But what Katie provided, I think it did an exceptional job on, is the framework. If there's a lot more money in play, curves change. But the main decisions that will be before this board will be very similar. What do you do at a couple points of where the curves change? What do you do with things, for example, right above a cliff that will still be there from 600? more generosity of subsidies and different distribution of them, change curves on either side, et cetera. But I think, Katie, I really do want to appreciate you and the team for creating a very good structure. The board will begin working with that structure with a far clearer set of exactly what it's working with in June, and it will be advised and will be helped by that advisory process between now and then. Art?
Thank you, and thank you, Katie, for that incredible presentation, which put me to sleep at times, but also woke me up later as well. But I know the work and the hard work you all and the team put into it, and I just want to say thank you so much. Number one. Number two, a special shout out to the people representing poverty organizations. I started my career as a lobbyist for California Rural Legal Assistance when Ronald Reagan was governor, and then I was a lobbyist for the United Farm Workers. So I recall many times giving that kind of testimony before legislative committees. It is not an easy task. It is not an easy task. And I just want to thank you for continuing your perseverance, continue your efforts, and continue your commitment to the dignity of human beings in this state. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Art. And so we're now going to turn to our budget with one last note, I very much appreciate the note for the Marketing Advisory Committee meeting. Please know, just as we've been doing planning with regard to the systems for the last 3 months, when we've been doing focus groups and we've been doing message testing, we have been testing what works and doesn't work of talking about or not talking about or how to talk about a penalty, talking about or not talking about levels of subsidies, talking about if you talk about new subsidies and a consumer comes in and finds they are not eligible for that, does it piss them off? How does it piss them off? What's that mean? And so I very much appreciate the observation because you're absolutely right. We will have a core job of using our $100 million of investments in supporting agents, navigators, of our marketing spend to message right to get the biggest possible enrollment. And so it's a very important observation again, but do know that we aren't starting that work starting in July. We've been starting that work from January when we saw from 1810, these are some of the prospects that will be informing our planning going forward. With that, I'm very happy to introduce Dora Mejia. Dora is our Chief Financial Officer. We're now talking about our budget. And I want to note, this is one of the issues that what you've just heard from Katie, not surprisingly, impacts our budget. On some levels, we have to do planning as we always had in some uncertain times. I would note that you'll hear from Dora that we're taking the very prudent budgeting approach of looking forward to next year in the event there is no state penalty and no subsidies, steady state in policy. We think if that is the case, there will be, and you'll hear the numbers specifically, hundreds of thousands of Californians fewer with health insurance. That matters to those consumers far more than it matters to our budget. That matters to people showing up in hospitals and walking out owing hundreds of thousands of dollars or not going to the doctor when they should, getting preventive care. But it also has implications for our budget that you're going to hear about. The other thing you'll see is we know that our budget is a big deal, is worth picking apart. The budget is over 130 pages. It's that long because we believe in being publicly accountable and being transparent. Half of that budget is going through each of our various divisions and talking about what they spent a year ago, what we project they'll spend next year, accomplishments, and what those mean. We know the various folks that care about what we do have not had a chance to pour through that with a fine-tooth comb since we released that this morning, which is another one of the reasons why we don't act on this until next meeting in June and provide an opportunity between now and then to take comments on these issues. With that, I turn it to Dora Mejia. Dora, take it away. You need to turn your mic on there. Little talky face.
I don't see it. There we go. Thank you. Dora Mejia, Chief Financial Officer. Welcome, Secretary Galley. Let me see. There you go. So before I start my budget presentation, I want to mention that we have a different look to our report today. Not only is it bigger, we actually combined two of our previous reports. Last year, we produced a budget report, and we also produced an annual report to the governor and legislature. Given that these two reports shared many areas of common information, we decided to merge the two reports. And in this year, we have what we've now called the Covered California Annual Report for fiscal year 2019-20. This is a proposal, but hopefully you'll adopt it next month. So before we begin our 2019-20 budget, I want to tell you what we've done in 2018-19, the year we're currently in. In June, you approved a budget of $340 million for our operating expenditures. We're going to conclude projected at $320 million. We have $20 million in savings, and those are across 3 different areas. We're saving about $7 million in personal services, about $10 million in major contracts, and $3 million in other areas, general expense type items. But on the positive side, we're ending with $36 million more than we projected in revenue. That's coming from 2 different areas. One, $12 million from unexpended funds from last year. We had anticipated higher expenditures, but they're actually not going to come to fruition, so we're bringing those savings forward into this year. And then because we had projected a 12% loss in enrollment due to the federal mandate penalty, we actually did better. And so we're going to bring in almost $24 million more in revenue this fiscal year for a total contribution of $36 million. Now you may be wondering, what are we going to do with that $340 million versus $320 million? We have that $20 million. We're going to ask you to fund and increase the capital projects reserve so that we can prepare for those expiring leases. While we are ending the year with a really good reserve of almost $350 million, that also equates to 11.6 months of reserve. We're always trying to keep our reserve between 9 and 12 months as per board direction, and we're right in with those guidelines. In this slide, it tells you where the savings are across the areas. And as you can see, they're spread amongst all our major program areas. Again, the big savings is from unfilled positions. We're simply struggling a little bit more than we had anticipated filling positions. They're staying vacant longer, more months than we'd like, but we're going to make more of a concentrated effort to fill those positions in the coming year. And in technology, we have a bit of savings because of the new CRM, that's customer relationship management system we're inputting. In Service Center, we have savings again because they have positions they've been unable to fill, and a small savings in the other areas. Now let's go look at 2019-20. As Peter already mentioned, we're ending the year much better than we had anticipated. In this slide, he's already gone over that while new enrollment was down, our renewals were up, and in relationship to what we budgeted, we're much better. We had budgeted for a 12% decline in enrollment, but we're actually going to see an increase of 157,000 enrollments more than what we had projected in last year's budget in our base enrollment. So even with all these different challenges, we're actually in a very prudent position. Now for our forecast, I want to talk about the assumptions that we used to inform that forecast. For the first base estimate, we assumed that we would continue with the elimination of the federal mandate penalty. We also are seeing already 3/4 of those enrollment losses in the first year of that this fiscal year. We're going to anticipate year-over-year reductions for plan years 2022. And then we're still projecting an increase in medical cost trends of 7%. For this next fiscal year, we're actually anticipating 8.6% increase in premiums. What does that mean for our budget year-over-year in enrollment? From 18-19 to 19-20, we project about 31,000 fewer consumers coming in the door. And then for the next year, 36,000, and then going into 21-22, about 10,000 member loss. You'll see that that has a less, impact on our revenues, but a major impact on our enrollment. There we go. So as Peter mentioned, we did two different models, one with the elimination of the federal mandate penalty and one incorporating the state subsidy and mandate penalty. And in this slide, you can see what our enrollment projections are if we keep our steady state, and one that includes the governor's proposal of penalty and subsidies. And you can see the big increase in enrollment if that law is passed. We anticipate for fiscal year 1920, we're going to have 257,000 more members, almost 300,000 the following year, and over 300,000 in 21-22 if that law should go into effect. Let's go to the next slide. Now I'm going to show you what that looks like over multiple years. Oh, this is a bit small. Sorry about that. Again, this is our base forecast, and it assumes, again, continued impact from the elimination of the federal mandate penalty, but it does still incorporate a reduction in the fee assessment. We're currently at 3.75%. Next year, we're anticipating going to 3.5. That's what we're going to bring to you next month. The year after that, it's 3.25, and then further reduction down to 3%. That's really good because it helps keep premiums lower. On and off exchange, what that means for per member per month, it's pretty steady throughout the years. We're at about $22 per member. Off exchange, we're at about $14 per member. So at least it's not increasing. We're trying to keep it steady. The overall increase in the budget from the current year is about 6%. I'd like to also note that the increase in the budget, there's about $5 million related to the work we're going to have to do to implement the subsidy program. Here we also anticipated a year-over-year increase in expenditures of approximately 3%. Not everything goes up and not everything comes down. So we did a kind of moderated increase of 3%. You'll see that even anticipating a loss in enrollment because of the elimination of the federal mandate penalty, we're still ending 21-22 with a healthy 8.5% months reserve. That still gives us 3 years to make any adjustments we have to make. So we know that we're planning for next year, but we're always looking out to future years of what that's going to hold for us. In addition to the base enrollment, we also always do a high and a low enrollment forecast, and you can find that in the appendix. We do those estimates because we want to see if things got really bad, worse than we anticipated, could we still make it? And we would have enough time to adjust. If things came in really great, then that means we could even possibly lower our fees more. So in the governor's May revised budget, Katie already talked about the appropriation, the general fund appropriations to pay subsidies. And I really want to note that the appropriation doesn't increase our budget. It doesn't go into our California Health Trust Fund. It's a general fund appropriation that is separate from our budget. And it doesn't impact our ability to function as an independent public agency. And also it doesn't affect your authority to increase expenditures as needed. Those are separate budgets, and we're simply going to make payments out of that separate appropriation for subsidies for consumers. So let's look at what does a base scenario look with a state penalty and subsidies incorporated into it. You already saw the increase in enrollment that we project for next year of 257,000 members, and it also increases our revenue. Our expenditures we kept the same because we've already incorporated the additional expenditures of $5.2 million that we feel we'll need in next year to pay subsidy payments. But what you will note that in the out years, we're exceeding 12 months of reserve. We're going to be bringing in more revenue, so we'll have to make adjustments before we get there, should everything materialize. And we'll have plenty of time to do that before we accumulate that much money. In this base scenario, we did not change the assessment rate. We kept it the same as the other base. We did not change expenditures. We know there are going to be variable expenditures should we have more enrollment, especially at the service center. We know that if we get a lot of calls, we'll probably have to increase that budget. Right now, we've anticipated, we've given them a base budget, but should they really get inundated with phone calls with people not understanding what this program is, we can always come back to you and adjust that budget. We will expect a reduction in premium should the enrollment increase as we anticipate. In this slide, here is where the breakout is of what we've increased our budget by in order to implement the state subsidy work. We anticipate $15 million over 3 years for the CalHERE system so that our consumers can enroll and so that we can process payments and that we can do that year-end reconciliation to assist the consumers. We also need $150,000 so that they can come in and apply for exemptions as needed. And then we have $100,000 built in for data integrity purposes. There we go. As Peter spoke about earlier today, I know you discussed our leases in closed session. So last year we started our capital projects reserve so that we could set aside money for those expiring leases and the increased costs that we know we're going to have to incur. This is going to help us because it's going to help streamline expenditures year over year so you don't have these big bumps and in the increased expenditures, because when we have to do either tenant improvements or other changes to a lease, it can get pretty expensive. So we want to kind of smooth out those expenditures and be ready for that. So let's look at our 1920 proposed budget. There we go. So the proposed budget is for a total of $381 million. $361 million of that is for operating expenditures. $20 million is to increase the capital project reserve. We're actually asking to fund fewer positions because we eliminated some temporary positions and included some permanent positions to help our service center. It aligns with our strategic pillars. You'll see that when you have a chance to read our budget. They've done a very good job of aligning every expenditure to meet one of your pillars. And we'll be coming back in June to ask you to approve that budget. And then to provide you a bit more detail of what's in that budget, we also have increases for those things that are sort of housekeeping, like labor union contract increases, increases to pension payments, increases for pro rata, all those kind of sundry type items. Those are already included in that budget. And here's a nice pie chart. What I want to point out here is that we've taken some information technology costs and aligned them better with the area that they're actually impacting. While our information technology oversees the projects, they're actually really helping either service center or our consumer engagement, our consumer enrollment system, so we align them there so you can see where they really belong. And I'd like to point out that of this $361 million budget, 75% of it is directly related to helping consumers. Peter's going to talk to you a little bit about the program highlights for the budget.
Yeah, just one, I know people haven't had a chance to read it, but I would call your attention to the executive summary where we highlight 6 things that programmatically that you'll be seeing coming forward in the next fiscal year. First, as Dora and Katie noted, we look to help the state implement expanded subsidies and the penalty to make sure consumers are aware of it and that they understand to the extent there are new subsidies, they avail themselves them as much as possible. Note, as you saw in the background material, for people over 400%, the vast majority are currently buying coverage outside of Covered California. So reaching out to them through agents, through others, to make them aware of coverage that they can now get less expensively, and to use the information for those under 400 and over 400 that there's more subsidy available is going to be critical. Second area is marketing and outreach. Now, we aren't increasing the budget, but we're staying at the neighborhood of $111 million for outreach and marketing, which includes $45 million for direct paid advertising and our substantial investments in the service center. Those two investments, our marketing outreach sales and our service center investments, are about new enrollment as well as retention. We're very happy with the retention we've had this year. We want to keep on having that level of retention. Third, we take very seriously our efforts to hold our health plans to account to make sure they actually are delivering high quality care and are part of changing the delivery system. We look forward to talking to the board at the next meeting in June and some early reports from some of the work we've been doing to build for the revision of our contractual requirements on plans related to health plan quality, health equity, issues of changing the delivery system. And that's going to be a major initiative for plan management, but it'll reach far beyond plan management. Fourth, also in the area of plan management, I noted this earlier, we look forward to, in this next fiscal year, planning for 2021 and doing what in many ways is our next big leap in the area of benefit designs. Our benefit designs today are a model for the nation. They're a model where, for the vast majority of our consumers, a deductible is not between a consumer and seeing their doctor, getting a drug, because the deductible doesn't apply unless it's hospital care. But we think there's ways that we should investigate going beyond that, looking at what are often called value-based insurance designs that have no co-pays for people with particular chronic conditions, whether for doctor's visits or for treatments. So we're going to be doing planning around that in this next period to hopefully test that and use that in large parts of California in 2021. Similarly, we've been doing a lot in the area of data and analytics to assure quality, assure equity. This is one of the things we've had many call on us, getting more data out there. As we look at the next year's plan contracts, we're looking at having ability to share more granular information, to share differences between carriers at that level of data, but analyzing that data to focus on quality, on better care across California. And finally, we're making significant investments in improving our efficiency. Some of these things may not be fun and interesting outside of our shop, but our capital management solution means many supervisors in Cover California spend a lot of time checking and reviewing their staff's timesheets. There's better ways to do it that make their ability to spend more time working with their team and working with consumers. We're also, as you've heard, doing a lot of work on space planning. These are big issues. They're reflected in a budget which shows very moderate growth and reflecting our continued commitment to make sure we're mindful that every dollar we spend is in essence a dollar out of premiums. So with that, I'll turn it back to you on the financial side, Dora.
Thank you. There it goes. So what I want to point out in this slide again is that we're going into 1920 with $350 million, which is a healthy reserve. And our revenue is still at a very good pace at $373 million. And again, that's with still the federal mandate penalty not being in place. We're still going to reduce our assessment rate from 3.75 to 3.5%. And this equates to an assessment of about 2.3% for consumers across mirror products off the exchange. And we're going to keep our small business assessment rate still at the 5.2%. We're not going to change that this year. Overall, a very good outlook. Let's see how it looks compared to last year. So here's our budget for last year, and here's our new proposed budget. As Peter said, on sales and marketing, it's pretty flat. We're not increasing a whole lot there. Service center is increasing a bit. Information technology, it looks like it's decreasing, but really that's because we're spreading some of the direct costs to the area that it's associated with. We're not actually reducing their costs. And then also, as you can see, we've reduced positions just a little bit. It's really more of an alignment. Again, the variance is $21 million, but $5.2 million of that is related to subsidy increases. So overall, from like budgets from last year to this year, it's about a 5% overall increase. one big change you'll see in June when we come back to you, assuming that the subsidy mandate proposal is enacted into law, is we're going to bring you back one base enrollment and revenue assumption. We're not going to bring you back to, we're going to see if the law passes, depending on what that proposal looks like, we're going to model it and incorporate into a revenue enrollment assessment and bring that to you for approval. We're also going to bring back the proposal to lower the assessment rate from 3.75 to 3.5%, ask you to approve $20 million for capital projects, and also ask you to approve the transfer from the current year savings of $20 million to the capital project reserve, so we can keep that at an appropriate level. With all that said, we're going to close the year in a very solid position with solid reserves, and we've done well to adapt to all these uncertainties that are out there. And that concludes my proposed budget for today. And I really want to thank the team. My team have worked so darn hard this year, not only in working on this budget, but also in doing a lot of the work for technical assistance on the subsidy modeling. They're an excellent group. Thank you.
And if I could, Paul, I want to join Dora in thanking both the finance team, which have just done remarkably great work, but also that work's been supported by the entire organization, which has done a lot of budget work, have been told, sorry, don't come asking for a lot more staff. I mean, and as you all know, everyone always wants more people, but the fact that we are dealing with so much uncertainty and dealing with it phenomenally well is a tribute to both the staff and finance brokering that process. The last thing I'd note is, before turning it to the board for questions and then public comment, is, again, we understand this is a big budget book. We're accepting comments between now and June. We expect this will not be exactly like this. There will be tweaks, revisions, and we'll highlight what those changes are, the biggest of which will be changes that may relate to the what happens with the legislature. But I'd note, we do not plan on, even if the penalty is adopted as our subsidies, we plan to be our operating budget. So it will mean we'll have next year more flexibility, more reserve, but we do not anticipate coming back with, oh, hot dog, more people insured, let's spend more money. We are always mindful of trying to be as close to the best we can be, because again, it's premium dollars at play. So with that, are there questions from the board before turning it to the public?
Well, thank you, Dora, for the work and the analysis and all the team effort here. I guess the one question I have is, as we recognize that we're moving into a different policy environment, whatever the legislature may choose to do on the mandate and on the subsidies, it does seem like the need to do outreach and education to eligible or newly subsidized members will be an uptick. And I just want to make sure that this budget reflects our intent to be able to do that effectively.
If you don't mind, I'll take that one. Is it, I constantly go back to Colleen, who runs the marketing area, and ask, can we spend more well? And the question is well. And one of the things that we do is not only look at our spend, but we work with every one of our 11 health plans to assess what they spend and how we are collectively spending money. The marketing team has not said, no, they need an extra 20 million, so to speak. And they've said this last year, we were worried that we need to do more marketing because of the penalty going away. So in some ways, it's a shift of focus rather than needing more money. But it's something that we sort of take to heart, and I will continue to go back to the marketing team to say, is there additional marginal good investments that could make more difference? We seek to spend money well. And it's one of the, and I really have to do a call out to the marketing team. Most parts of an organization you go to and say, do you want more money? They'd say, heck yeah. Marketing, think very thoughtfully and say, we can spend a little bit more money here, more there, but we think we're at sort of a good incremental point of making very solid, broad investments in a range of places. But we'll take that on council and see if there are marginal additional investments, but we think that we're well funded to make investments, shifting resources from last year, losing a penalty, to hopefully this year having a penalty, but how we talk about that is a key issue.
Any other comments or questions from the board?
Thank you.
Stick around just in case, Dora.
So I guess we will now turn to public comment.
Good afternoon, Jen Fleur on behalf of Western Center on Law and Poverty. We commend the staff because I don't envy having to do projections in this environment with everything shifting week by week. We are happy to see that the per member per month is still projected to go down because that does affect people, even those that aren't getting the subsidies. And if we're getting into a new place of state-based subsidies, that's going to be even more important. And then I am forgetting what else I came up here to say. Just the one other thing on the marketing, and I'm glad that you asked about that. Western Center and Health Access are proud to co-sponsor legislation that will give Covered California additional tools on marketing. It will both enable them to land people coming from Medi-Cal directly into a plan in Covered California, as well as enable them to do more targeted outreach to people who are losing other forms of insurance. So we're hopeful that it moves through the process and that can inform this budget as well.
Good afternoon. Jack Daly, the Health Consumer Alliance, and also the Legal Aid Society of San Diego. We've been a longtime partner with Covered California. Really do appreciate Dr. Hernandez's comments about the need to step up outreach and education in this environment of changes, and wanted to highlight the role that we play in our communities on behalf of Covered California, helping educate consumers about the changes that are coming from the state and the federal government, in addition to helping them navigate through the application, enrollment, and appeal process as necessary, looking to resolve things in the most efficient way. So certainly appreciate the ongoing support and partnership with Office of Legal Affairs, with which now our contract exists, and wanted to thank you for your ongoing support.
Good afternoon. MJ Diaz here, subbing for Beth on behalf of Health Access California. At first glance, we are in support of your proposed budget, especially as it relates to the budget expenditures to help implement whatever state subsidy program and mandate program we end up having. We think that those resources are critical for the successful rollout of this state-specific program, especially as you know, there will be many more Californians who will need to learn the differences between a state subsidy program versus the federal subsidy program that combined together would help them make their coverage more affordable. We also support the marketing, outreach, and sales education investment. This is in stark contrast of what we see at the federal level. We appreciate the robustness of this budget, and it speaks to the work that you all are doing in all aspects of how we can get a consumer connected to coverage. And lastly, we do support the Policy Evaluation and Research Division investment as well. Health Access uses all of your studies, and we cite your studies on our fact sheets to help, advocate for great proposals that we have in the legislature alongside our partners with Western Center, CPAN, and other consumer advocacy organizations. Thank you.
Carrie Sanders with CPAN. Ditto to what MJ said on the publications. I just wanted to appreciate the finance staff and the folks for the discussion on the budget today, and we look forward to reviewing it more carefully. But just wanted to say a couple things. We really appreciate Covered California's continued investment in the quality work, the delivery system reform, and also the focus on disparities reduction. So really happy to see that in there. Also appreciate holding the marketing budget, somewhat steady. We understand, glad to hear that there are thoughts about how best to use those funds. As others have encouraged you to think about, what marketing will look like with potential new subsidies, and then at the same time to make sure to be considering the potential impact of changes at the federal level, such as public charge and other types of rules that might change the way people view insurance. So thank you.
Hi, Leslie Choi with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. So we've been a Navigator partner since OEP1, and with our 20 Navigator partners across the state, we really have worked very closely with Cover California and your staff since the beginning, and really grateful for the partnerships with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. With each passing open enrollment period, we have definitely seen firsthand how difficult, outreach, education, and enrollment has been to our communities. And so we definitely support Dr. Hernandez's keen insights and comments reflecting on the need for sufficient funding for outreach, education, and enrollment, as we've already begun to see the chilling effects of the public charge rollout. So this funding will be extremely critical moving forward, and we hope that you'll consider this moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you. And before we move to the next topic, one other thing I want to note on marketing is Katie ran out, and by the way, Katie, that's very good to get a plug specifically for your division. I don't know that was very good, but is noted some of the issues with regard to the penalty revenue. I want to note that in 3 years ago, the last time we had a data point, the federal penalty was collected at almost double the rate FTB is projecting for. And some of the reasons for that is, number one, California will have fewer lower income people paying the penalty because of where we have tax filing. So there was comments about who pays it, but there will be many fewer. And number two, and this is really critical when we think about our role in marketing, historically the IRS has done no contact with people that paid a federal penalty. We have a commitment from this administration and from FTB and Cover California to do something very, very different. We don't want anyone to pay a penalty. So we will be, if there is a penalty payer, getting data from the Franchise Tax Board to reach out and aggressively encourage them to get coverage. So that's, I think it's really important to note that none of us in the administration, in the legislature, in Cover California, see the penalty as a revenue stream that's a good thing. We don't want people paying a penalty. And so the note around what will that mean for our marketing, nothing this year. I mean, we're doing a lot to change marketing, but we will be working this year to design with FTB how we might do targeted follow-ups, et cetera. So in our next fiscal year budget, because of the time lag of when people don't file, getting filed information, you would, in the event there is a penalty, hear new initiatives that we'll have in place in 2021, which is after penalty people get paid, to make sure hopefully they don't do it again. And just some of these interactions are quite complex, but again, I think it is really to the credit of California to say it's not our job to keep more people paying a penalty to generate revenue. Everyone that's working on these issues is trying to say fewer penalty payers is better. We want people having insurance. And I think that's a real credit to the administration and also the legislature that has thought about, yeah, let's have a penalty to get people to do the right thing. Not because it's a way to get money, but because we want people to have health insurance. So with that, I want to thank, again, Dora and the finance team very much. This was a discussion topic, and your notes that there's a lot to read. You haven't read it all. Please do. We welcome your comments. The revised budget will come back and we'll highlight where there are changes. The next topic is mine, because I think they think that I'll go through it quickly, which I hopefully will. We've brought this up briefly before, but I want to remind the board that we have 3 standing advisory committees currently established by the board: a plan management advisory committee, a marketing outreach committee, and a small employer health options program committee. Quick and dirty, the SHOP advisory committee has not been meeting regularly, and we think the issues that it deals with would be far better served merging it into the plan advisory committee. Number 2, when we established the Marketing and Outreach Committee, which I really do not try to speak acronyms, so some people call it the MOA. I don't know how to say it, so I will try to use full words, full sentences. The Marketing Committee had a charter of meeting a minimum of twice a year. Our original charters had set times of meeting quarterly. We want to bring back for action at the next board meeting 2 changes. One, to formally transfer the SHOP advisory committee functions to plan management. There may certainly be a subcommittee of the SHOP of the plan management. We'll look at that, but want to have a broader forum. It's virtually mostly the same plans, many similar issues, but we want to make sure it has a continued forum. We also want to not have established in their charter exactly how many times a year meetings occur. It's whether they need to be more or less, setting it in a charter, you set up meetings you don't need to have. We have had a tradition of having more meetings if we need them and let each committee do that. So we want to bring that back to the next meeting for action to delegate not setting in their charter, thou shalt meet quarterly. Maybe it's more, maybe it's going to be less, but we're evolving these committees. They've been phenomenally important. We are an organization committed to broad input. It's part of why we do a good job. We get good, thoughtful input from a range of stakeholders. So that's a forthcoming recommendation for action at the next meeting. Let me pause to see if there's questions from the board on that. Are there comments from stakeholders?
Hi again, MJ Diaz here on behalf of Health Access California. We support this transfer of the SHOP advisory group to the plan management group. Many of the policy discussions that we engage in the plan management group are really relevant to the covered California small business issue area, and functionally we actually engage in similar topics, and so we support this. Many of the stakeholders are already part of the plan management advisory group. We have really good, close working relationship with, and I think that in the larger long-term goal of figuring out what to do with Covered California SHOP and also its role in the small group market, we're happy to include that in the conversations through plan management. Thank you.
Alicia Kauk with the National Health Law Program. First, just wanted to say that we support the efforts to make the meetings more flexible in that then the advisory groups can be more responsive to both state and federal legislative and administrative action. So I think we look forward to that through the MOA group. And just an additional note that I think our preference would be that decisions related to reconfigurations of the advisory groups remain items that come before the board. Thank you.
I'll just be brief. I think we, agree with the comments of our colleagues. We support having the SHOP discussions and plan management. I think that's essentially what has been happening. We appreciate still having the marketing outreach enrollment advisory group. It's been particularly important, especially just this discussion that we just had about upcoming changes in terms of who may be eligible, subsidies, things like that. And it's been helpful, I think, to have those conversations and be able to provide input into the Covered California's thinking about marketing. And we similarly, support decisions about reconfiguration actually going through the board. But other than that, we're supportive of flexibility. Thanks.
Jen Flory, Western Center on Law and Poverty. I'll keep it short. We're supportive of the flexibility. We do think the configuration should be before the board, and plan management already has sufficient flexibility where if we need to go down the rabbit hole on a certain topic, we've had subgroups and things like that, and so just formally moving SHOP into plan management makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in hearing those comments, one of the things, we will bring back clarity on the proposal about the balance between flexibility on processes from reconfiguration. So I don't think the intent was to delegate to the executive director a whole hog reconfiguring, and so we'll certainly work with advocates to figure out how we frame that as we come back to the board. Thank you very much. Okay. Oh, and we have someone on the phone. Hot dog. Yes, we do. Thank good eye, Mark. That's very good. Operator, do we have someone on the phone who'd like to comment?
Yes, we do have from the line of George Balteria from Quote Selection Insurance Services. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for comments. George Balteria with Quote Selection Insurance Services. I actually tried pressing *1 before on the previous budget section, and I just wanted to comment about the budget. I appreciate, especially from our organization on the insurance agent channel, that we get great support from Covered California, from the sales, outreach, and marketing division. And much of the budget is not, or none of the budget is tied to agent compensation. And I appreciate in the previous board meetings that Covered California has taken up the issue of agent compensation as it relates to with the insurance carriers. And I would like to just bring a reminder to the board that with the 48% of new enrollments that come in with Covered California on average per year, that agent compensation will continue to be an important discussion point for the future success of potential new legislation.
George, thank you very much, and thank you for coming back after trying your star earlier. Your comments are welcome, and thanks for your work. For those that don't know, George is also on, I believe, chairs the Marketing Outreach Advisory Committee, and is a great example of someone truly on the front lines working with navigators, but also being an agent that has a number of storefronts enrolling thousands of individuals. So thank you very much, George. With that, the last topic is a discussion topic. It is a small granular that we will be able to handle, I think, very efficiently and briefly with Linda Anderson from Covered California for Small Business. I will remind all of you, we don't call it SHOP anymore. We call it Covered California for Small Business.
Oh.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome, Dr. Gatley. We're here today just for a discussion for authorization to submit emergency rulemaking to the Office of Administrative Law. Just to provide a little bit of background, Covered California was granted emergency rulemaking authority by the legislature through January 1st, 2022 for eligibility enrollment regulations for both the individual and small business exchanges. We wanted to take that opportunity to reassess our current process and fees that are currently in our regulations. Currently, right now, CCSB regulations limit the fee charged for processing a check returned to Covered California for non-sufficient funds to $25. And that fee only represents a fraction of the cost for actually processing those non-sufficient fund payments. What we also identified was there were two couple of provisions within the government code that authorizes the board to adopt regulations to operate CCSB, including assessing these fees. What we're here today is we would like to propose regulation changes to recover the actual cost to process those payments for return insufficient funds while staying competitive. Here are just a high level of what our proposed regulatory changes would be. We're proposing amendments to recover the actual cost of processing a payment returned for insufficient funds. These fees would be set by Covered California annually, at reasonable charges that would be assessed. The amendment also requires employers to submit a different form of payment methods, such as money order and cashier's checks after 2 non-sufficient payments within a 12-month period. Oh, sorry. I don't know if you, this is just our language that we're proposing to our current CCSB, Covered California for Small Business, regulations, section 6532E. And lastly, any additional proposed changes to our current CCSB eligibility enrollment regulations, we'll continue to communicate that with our stakeholders for review and commenting period prior to action for our next board June meeting. Thank you.
Any board questions on this? I'm shocked there aren't. Any public comment on this? Mr. Fear, you can adjourn.
I think we are ready to adjourn. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Mark will talk soon. Yeah, all right, thanks.
Peter, are we going to, we'll get a